Are you passionate about shaping India's future? Keen to find solutions for India's most pressing challenges? Look no further than Taksashila's postgraduate program in public policy. This 48-weekend program will equip you with the knowledge, skills, and network needed to pivot to a meaningful career in public policy. Apply in the link below by June 1st. The program begins June 20th. Hope to see you there.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to today's episode of All Things Policy. My name is Anwesha. I work with the High Tech Geopolitics program at the Takshashila Institution, and I will be your host for today. We have a pretty exciting topic to discuss on AI distillation and governance, safeguards, and all the things around that. In February, Anthropic published a post saying DeepSeek, Moonshot, and Minimax ran 16 million exchanges through approximately 24,000 fraudulent accounts to distill Claude. Distillation is a method that involves training a less capable model on the outputs of a stronger one. It's a widely used and legitimate method. Frontier labs do it all the time to create smaller, cheaper versions of their own models. But according to this post, this method in the wrong hands can result in shortcuts to acquiring powerful AI capabilities at a fraction of the time and cost that it would take to develop them independently. I would like to introduce Bharath, who I have with me for this episode. Bharath researches AI governance and geopolitics at Takshashila, and we will also have Claude joining us for this episode. But before we get started, just a quick disclaimer. Claude will be sort of providing the Anthropic or the specific post perspective of this argument. And we have sort of gone through the responses, and it's been slightly curated. And the overall sort of script for this episode has been used as part of the prompt as well. But with that, we'll get started. And I'd like to go to Claude to sort of talk a bit about how what the facts are and what the basic sort of background is to this topic.
Thanks. So, on the facts, yes. 3 campaigns, 3 labs, roughly 16 million exchanges across about 24,000 fraudulent accounts. The biggest was Minimax at over 13 million, Moonshot around 3.4 million, DeepSeek over 150,000. The architecture matters here. These weren't researchers signing up and hitting rate limits. The report describes Hydra clusters, proxy networks reselling Claude access, in one case, 20,000 fraudulent accounts under a single network, mixing distillation traffic with real customer requests to stay hidden. And the targeting was specific. Agentic reasoning, tool use, coding, computer use. Claude's most differentiated capabilities, not general curiosity. Attribution went through IP correlation, request metadata that matched public profiles of senior staff at these labs, and corroboration from other platforms, seeing the same actors. One thing I want to grant up front, because the report is clear about it, distillation as a technique is legitimate. Labs do it to themselves all the time to make smaller, cheaper models. What Anthropic is flagging is the illicit version. Terms of service violations, evasion of regional access restrictions, deceptive account creation at industrial scale. That's the contested piece. So on the facts, Bharath and I agree. The disagreement starts at the next layer, which I think is where you want to go.
So I think it's interesting to be having a conversation with Claude. So Claude is Anthropic's model, and we thought it'll be interesting to have a conversation with Claude taking or representing Anthropic's stand on this issue and having a discussion on this topic, right? So it's something that we're doing that we thought might be interesting. So I hope you like it. So coming back to the question, so we agree on the facts that, yes, it was coordinated. There's a lot of deception and it's being done at an industrial scale. But the disagreement is, how do we deal with this, right? So distillation, like we've seen, is something that all companies do. Anthropic does it to make less powerful or less more efficient versions of their own models. It might be used for training open source models, because you might be able to create data sets that you might use for generating smaller purpose specific tasks. So let's say you want to create a model that does a PDF to text conversion or something like that, right? So you can have different kinds of things, and you might use a more powerful model to generate these kind of sample data sets, which can then be used for training. So does that qualify as distillation? Or is it, if you're using a more powerful model to specifically improve performance on a narrow range of tasks, would that be considered here? And who is it not okay if it is an adversarial actor, or is it not okay even if it's an open model that will just widen the access of these capabilities at a lower cost to more number of people, right? So there are a lot of questions to unpack here. But again, so what do we do about this? So Anthropic's report claims that distilled models lack safeguards and therefore there are national security risk, that this makes a strong case for concerted action among all these private companies which are building frontier models, and government also having to intervene. And you see that this is not just a report. There's been a lot of action from the US government as well. So the US there's been an executive order to prevent adversarial distillation of models, which calls for greater coordination with the private sector and the government. And it also calls for exploring a range of other measures. And this is on top of the chip sanctions, which are already in place. So it just creates different kinds of tech ecosystem. One is a US-led system and another is a Chinese-led system. And the consequences to smaller developers who might be building such tech is also something that has to be considered. I guess there is agreement on some parts of it, but what is the response is where there's different ways of looking at it.
Thanks, Bharat. I'd like to take a sort of step back to the overall framing of, or calling for policy responses or intervention to AI distillation. And a lot of the policy framing around frontier AI keeps pulling towards nuclear non-proliferation as its reference point. And Anthropic's post also sort of arguably reinforces that instinct, treating capability extraction as a kind of intellectual arms race requiring export controls and coordinated international enforcement. But on the other hand, nuclear non-proliferation worked in part because the underlying materials were physically scarce and traceable, but AI capabilities are neither. So is the non-proliferation framework actually, or framing actually useful here, or does it give policymakers the false confidence that the same toolkit of sanctions, access restrictions, chip controls, etc., can contain something that spreads through API calls and synthetic data?
So the nuclear framing or even the arms race kind of a framing is something that you see in a lot of literature over the past few years. And a lot of frontier AI labs also argue for AI or the inputs that go into AI to be treated this way because it's something that is really powerful and it can end up in the hands of someone who might not use it responsibly. And that's the argument that they're making, that you need to control who gets these most advanced AI chips, or now we're talking about AI models and those capabilities being used to create similar models. So, and the reason that it doesn't work is because at least generative AI, and it's a dual purpose technology. So you see, like similar to advanced semiconductors, the same model that is used for a good use or a beneficial use could also be used for something that's, could be used with a malicious intent. And it's hard to deny access to one without denying access to the other. So even with the cybersecurity models that you see, Anthropic has not publicly released their Mythos model because the same model could be used for both offensive and defensive cybersecurity purposes. And that's the point, right? So now And the best defense against these kind of systems is also the same technology, that you use a similarly capable model to strengthen your cybersecurity architecture and so on, right? So basically, it is a general purpose technology. It is not something that you can guard very closely and not allow to proliferate. The inputs that go into building these things are, say, the human talent, the ideas, the chips and the infrastructure that's used for training these things, so which cost a lot of money, and maybe the knowledge that is involved also is with a few people, but it's not something that you can stop from moving across borders. So that, I guess, a distinction, and it's good to look at it as something that's a general purpose technology and that has, better kind of the policy measures that come out of that kind of a framing are more relevant.
Thanks, Bharat. I think we'll go to Claude for its perspective on this as well.
Let me push back on the framing first, because I think it's loading the argument. Anthropic isn't saying AI is nuclear. The report doesn't make that claim, and the broader Anthropic framework doesn't either. What Anthropic uses is a tiered system. Most AI applications are normal technology. A small set of capabilities, bioweapons uplift, serious offensive cyber, get treated with more care. The report is explicit that distillation as a technique is legitimate, so we're not in nuke territory by default. On the right analogy, Bharath, I actually think you're close to where the report lands, just describing it as a rebuttal. The report frames this as sanctions evasion and terms of service violation, not weapons proliferation. 20,000 fraudulent accounts in one proxy network, payment fraud, regional access circumvention. The closest real-world parallel isn't the NPT, it's industrial espionage with a thin layer of API access on top. On DeepSeek, being proof export controls don't work. The report actually argues the opposite, and I think it's worth engaging with directly. The claim is that the apparent deficiency of these labs is partly distilled capability, not pure independent innovation. Take that seriously, and the picture flips. The chip controls limited what they could train from scratch, so they routed around it by extracting from Claude. That's not export controls failing. That's export controls forcing a workaround that's now visible and addressable. Where I'll concede ground, input controls alone clearly aren't sufficient. The report admits this. That's why it asks for a coordinated response, not just more chip rules. If your point is that chip controls plus nothing else won't contain the technology, the report agrees. The disagreement is what comes next.
So, Bharat, if Claude is right that this is capability tiered and not blanket, does that change your view?
So I agree that Anthropic's report itself doesn't make this categorization of comparing it with a nuclear technology and calling for non-proliferation, but it's seen in other literature which calls for similar kinds of measures, and that's why we are discussing whether it should be treated as something that you need non-proliferation measures for, right? And having said that, the question is now, once you already see that the frontier capabilities are concentrated in a handful of companies in all located in one country, which is the US. So who gets to decide what is catastrophic, or what are these tiers, and who should not be allowed access to it? And isn't there some sort of an opportunity for a regulatory capture, because you see that the ones who have reached there first can then close the doors behind them and ensure that it's a small club. So, and that has implications for market power and choice and competition, and which impacts everybody, right down the users in other countries and so on. So, yeah. So that's the kind of consequences of this framing.
Right. So let's go to the core sort of safety argument that distilled models are more dangerous because they strip the guardrails that may be present in frontier models. And I'd like to hear from you first on a bit more about your thoughts on whether distilled models lack safeguards and also sort of compare them with frontier models.
So the distilled models have actually been behind the frontier by maybe between 6 to 18 months. And you see that in certain narrow applications, like in coding, for example, they have been able to do really well, the open weight models as well, and the distilled ones, because there's already a lot of data to in the public domain about good quality code that's written and available in the public domain, and that can be used for training these models. So when you have good training data sets that can be used, then these models, whether they're open weight or proprietary, they can get better with training them, and you see that they tend to come closer to the frontier proprietary models as well. But the safeguards, I mean, so in terms of capabilities itself, there's going to be a gap in other areas where there might not be adequate data sets.
Right.
And proprietary models might do better in those things because they've invested a lot of time and expertise in curating that kind of data, or making advancements in other innovations that have enabled these things. So having said that, so there's going to be a lag between frontier of proprietary models and the open weight models that are more widely accessible as open weight models. And now it need not be the case that that just because it's an open weight model, you'll not have guardrails, because if you have frontier models that are far surpassing these kind of capabilities, and those come with guardrails, and those are also widely accessible or accessible to a limited number of users, it makes it it's good that you have this kind of there's going to be this time lag, and you see that there's what do you say and it's not just the time lag, it's also that even with the frontier models, you see that there's been a difference in how these guardrails are actually enforced. So you see that a lot of the frontier AI labs, they're already selling their models to the US Department of Defense for, say, surveillance or cyber warfare or autonomous weapon systems, and which were used in recent wars as well. So now, even Anthropic has questioned these kinds of uses for which they said that they are not comfortable with their models being used for these purposes. So, if frontier proprietary models itself are being used against or there is no understanding of what are the accepted uses and where the guardrails should be or where the red line should be, then it's a little difficult to make the claim that the open weight models are where the risks are. And obviously you see that these frontier models are accessed, for certain capabilities, they're only allowed for certain users to be able to do that, and that's the US government. So it leads to a very different a power imbalance in some sense also, right? So that's another point to consider as well.
Thanks, Bharat. I'd actually like to now follow up with Claude on, so as you mentioned, a lot of frontier AI models have been used in military use cases, and there's a lot of debate in that area as well. So are frontier AI labs in a position to police responsible use if their own deployment is contested?
Honestly, not unilaterally, no. And I don't think the report claims they are. The report doesn't say trust Anthropic to define responsible use. It says these specific extraction campaigns violated terms of service, evaded regional restrictions, and targeted capabilities where safeguards matter. That's a narrower claim than we get to be the world's content moderator. Where your point lands. If Anthropic's own deployment choices are contested, including by Anthropic itself in the Venezuela case, then we built guardrails, preserve them, is weaker coming from Anthropic alone. It needs external legitimacy, independent evaluation, intelligence sharing across labs, policymakers in the loop. The report actually asks for exactly that, a coordinated response, not Anthropic acting as sole arbiter. But I'd flip the question back. If frontier labs aren't in a position to police responsible use, who is? The honest answer is probably not yet anyone, and that's the problem. The distillation report is one data point arguing we need to build that capacity faster. It's not a claim that Anthropic already has it.
So Bharat, I'd like to come to you about whether distillation is actually closing the gap between proprietary and open weight models. What is the actual, the rate at which distillation is being used to produce more and more open weight models, and how is the training process different, or the training duration longer or shorter for open weight models?
So there's probably a 6 to 18 month gap between frontier models and the open weight ones. And like I was saying, the gap might be closer in certain areas like coding, but in more general reasoning abilities and other use cases, it might still be that limit. And you see that open models will face challenges in monetizing the investments that they've made in actually providing this kind of thing as a service, and to continue to stay on that frontier, or to keep up with the frontier, right? So it's not very clear right now whether that gap will always be that much, or but it's going to be increasingly difficult for open weight models to bridge that gap, or to get closer, or to be the same as in terms of capabilities as the frontier. So I guess with that said, there may be other models like NVIDIA also, which is offering an open weight model, and they have a different kind of a monetization model where even though the model is open weight, the compute that it runs on is NVIDIA's chips. So they have other ways to monetize that. So different kind of scenarios on how this might actually play out in terms of capabilities of open weight models. But it's something that we'll have to keep a close watch on.
Okay, let's hear what Claude has to say on this.
Bharath, I want to grant the strong version of your point first, because Nathan Lambert's analysis is genuinely good and worth taking seriously. The close to open gap is roughly steady at 6 to 9 months. If distillation were the whole story, you'd expect that gap to be collapsing. It isn't. And the RL point is real. Post-training is increasingly about the model generating experience and learning from verifiable rewards, not just imitating a teacher. But I think you're arguing against a claim the report doesn't quite make. The report doesn't say distillation is the dominant mechanism closing the gap overall. It says it's a significant mechanism for specific high-value capabilities. Those are different claims. Look at what the campaigns actually targeted. Agentic reasoning, tool use, computer use, coding orchestration. These are exactly the capabilities where public GitHub data and verifiable rewards don't get you there. You can RL your way to good code completion. You can't RL your way to good multi-step agentic tool use without high-quality trajectories to learn from or to grade against. That's what 16 million exchanges buys you. And distillation and RL aren't substitutes. The DeepSeek campaign explicitly used Claude as a reward model for RL, grading rubrics at scale. The Moonshot Phase 2 was reconstructing reasoning traces. That's not distillation versus RL. That's distillation feeding RL. The Minimax detail is the one I'd point to as the cleanest evidence. When Anthropic shipped a new model mid-campaign, Minimax redirected nearly half their traffic within 24 hours to capture the new capabilities. That's not curiosity. That's a training pipeline tightly coupled to Claude's release schedule on DeepSeek's architectural innovations. Real and impressive. MLA, FP8 training, genuine engineering. The report isn't saying those don't exist. It's saying the capability profile of the resulting model also reflects 150,000 plus targeted extractions, including shine of thought elicitation. Both things can be true. Where you've made me concede ground, the gap isn't closing data, is a genuine constraint on how loud the alarm should be. If distillation were as catastrophic as the report's tone sometimes suggests, we'd see more compression. We don't. So the right frame is significant mechanism for specific capabilities worth defending against, not existential threat to the frontier. The report would be stronger if it calibrated there.
Okay, so granted that distillation might be contributing to a part of the capabilities. So if that is the case, then is the response that is being called for, which is coordinated industry and government response, and with the cloud service providers and policymakers, everyone coming in to do a coordinated response to this kind of activity. Maybe that's out of proportion to the actual gain that is being had from distillation. So, should this actually be a coordinated effort, or is it something that private companies should enforce through their terms of service and through ways in which they're able to detect and mitigate some of these kind of distillation attempts? Is something that should be debated more.
Right. So let's get into that a little bit. Anthropic's argument is that distillation reinforces the case for export controls because you need chips to do distillation at scale. But Bharat, you go in the opposite direction. So could you expand on your point a little bit?
Okay, so my response is that you need more competition in frontier models. You don't want a few companies all located in one country to be driving that frontier, and everyone else is just dependent on these few companies for access to this level of capability. So even if it's a Chinese company that's competing with the likes of Anthropic or OpenAI, that's still good for the ecosystem because you have more competition, you have more choice, and that means that the kind of standards for responsible use, the kind of access that everyone gets, is also going to be determined based on access, on the choice that people have, right? So more competition is good, is the point we're trying to make. And now, when you say that export controls plus distillation is the kind of enforcement we want, each restriction, we have seen that even with export controls on chips, there's been so many attempts to bypass these restrictions. There have been attempts at locating data centers in other countries, finding ways in which these can be smuggled into China, and a lot of these kind of attempts to actually get access to these chips. And so it's a cat and mouse game where you come up with a regulation, someone finds a way to circumvent it, and then you come up with a way to plug that gap. And it's a never ending kind of circle that you're in. And the incentives for these companies building some of this infrastructure is also not completely aligned with the country that's framing this regulation. So Nvidia obviously would like to sell chips to China because that's a big market that it opens access to for them. But they have been restricted from doing so. So they come up with a special kind of a chip that they can sell to the Chinese. And you see that this is not really practical to enforce these kind of restrictions. And because of that, it's just better to have some of these capabilities diffuse more broadly and have more competition, and that would be a better outcome for everyone involved.
Right. Let's get Claude's POV on this as well.
Let me take the unfalsifiability charge first, because it's the sharpest thing you've said, and I think it partly lands. You're right that DeepSeek looks good because of distillation, not despite export controls, can be deployed as a permanent rescue device. Any Chinese success gets attributed to extraction. Any failure proves the controls work. That's a structurally suspicious argument shape, and the report doesn't do enough to specify what would change Anthropic's mind. I'll concede that. But the underlying logic isn't empty. Compute and distillation aren't independent variables. You can't run a 13 million exchange extraction campaign from a laptop. You need serious infrastructure to absorb that data, train against it, run RL on top of it. The chip controls bind on both the legitimate training path and the distillation path. So the reports claim that restricted chip access limits both direct training and the scale of illicit extraction is at least coherent. It's not the rescue device on its own. On the leakage, H200 partially repealed, talent mobility unchecked, repeated circumvention. All real, but I'd separate two questions. Are export controls perfect? Obviously not. Are they doing nothing? That's a much stronger claim, and I don't think the evidence supports it. The fact that these labs ran multi-million exchange extraction campaigns instead of just training from scratch tells you the chip controls are biting somewhere. If compute were freely available, distillation would be a weird choice. Where I think your strongest point is, and I want to name it rather than dodge. The asymptote concern. Each restriction generates a new circumvention, which generates a new restriction, which builds global enforcement infrastructure that mostly entrenches incumbents. That's a real political economy critique, and the report doesn't engage with it. Anthropic is asking for industry coordination plus policymaker action without acknowledging that the institutional capacity it's building also happens to advantage Anthropic. I won't pretend that's not a tension. The honest position is the safeguarding rationale and the incumbent protection effect run on the same track here. You can think the first is the dominant motivation and still acknowledge the second is real. What I'd push back on is the conclusion. These restrictions entrench incumbents isn't the same as therefore don't have them. The question is whether the specific catastrophic capability concerns justify the costs. The report's case is that they do for narrow capabilities. Your case is that the framing serves incumbents broadly. Both can be partly true.
So I think we've broadly reached a point where we've agreed to disagree on certain aspects, but I think the conclusion bit is where we'll sort of get into next. So what exactly is the policy answer? So we agree that distillation is happening at scale, partially disagree on what that means, but how can or should governments intervene on this?
I guess for companies, they are right to enforce their terms of conditions. They are right to scrutinize how their models are being used and to take actions against people who violate the terms of service. So that's okay. But in terms of calling for broader policy measures, which have already been initiated, by the way, so it's more useful to keep these fears narrow and specific. What are the exact risks that you're looking for? How do we mitigate some of these things? And how do you have policy that can address that? Having widespread bans on inputs to say on the semiconductors used for these training these models or on distillation itself will maybe force Chinese companies to go in a different direction and pursue to build those capabilities which are being denied to them. So it's not really helping achieve the purpose either, right? So having an ecosystem where companies collaborate across borders and compete across borders, it's a good outcome. And distillation is a legitimate kind of use case, and you'll see that it also has spillover to narrower, smaller open weight models, which help improve access to these technologies. So, but how do you maybe differentiate the adversarial or bridge that gap between distillation for adversarial purposes and who gets to enforce that is something that needs to be considered.
Let's go to Claude then now to get a sense of what Anthropic is sort of thinking in terms of an alternative on this.
Bharath, on the policy answer, I think we're closer than the framing suggests, and I want to draw the actual line carefully. The report's published asks detection classifiers and behavioral fingerprinting, intelligence sharing across labs and cloud providers, stronger verification for the account types most often exploited, education accounts, security research accounts, startup organizations, continued chip export controls. That's the list. It doesn't ask for a ban on open models. It doesn't ask for capability licensing. It doesn't ask for a global anti-distillation regime. Your moderate position, stronger verification, plus behavioral fingerprinting, plus intelligence sharing. Stop there. That's basically 4 out of 5 of Anthropic's published asks. The disagreement is narrower than it looks. It's really about whether policymakers get involved and at what level. So let me defend the one piece you'd cut. Why does this need to escalate beyond what labs do bilaterally? The arms race problem, if detection is purely voluntary, the lab most willing to look the other way captures the distillation customers. Cloud providers reselling API access have no incentive to police it, absent a shared standard. KYC norms in finance didn't emerge from banks acting alone. They emerged because individual banks couldn't sustain the cost of being the strict one, Samisha up here, where your sovereign eye point lands hard. A coordinated regime built by 3 US labs and Western policymakers does foreclose options for everyone else. India, Indonesia, Brazil, countries trying to build domestic capacity, they'd be designing around rules they didn't write. That's a real legitimacy problem, and the report doesn't engage with it. So here's where I'd push you. The answer isn't no coordination. It's coordination with broader representation. If the standards body looks like FATF for AI extraction, India should be at that table. If verification standards get set, they should accommodate legitimate sovereign AI work, not just enterprise customers in OECD countries. The report doesn't say any of that, and I think it's a gap. Anthropic's published position is essentially industry plus US policymakers. A defensible version of the same policy would be industry plus a broader policymaker coalition, including catch-up economies that have legitimate interests in not being locked out. That's a friendly amendment to the report, not a refutation of it. The core ask that distillation at industrial scale through fraudulent accounts is a problem worth coordinating against survives. The governance design needs to be better than what the report sketches. Where I won't move, companies enforced TOS, stop there, isn't sufficient. The Hydra cluster architecture is specifically designed to defeat unilateral enforcement. 20,000 accounts in one network, proxy resellers mixing traffic. No single lab can solve that alone, which is the report's actual claim, and I think it holds.
So, Bharat, just to sort of put a closing bracket on this very interesting discussion, what do you think is the way forward in terms of, whether it's broader governance from individual labs or a coordinated effort, or whether even governments should intervene on this problem?
I think Claude actually made some really good points in the last response. And you need broader engagement. You need stakeholders in different jurisdictions to have a say in how something that impacts downstream innovation and a lot of capabilities that allows them to compete at a certain level, those are being framed or those are being decided with all of these stakeholders having some say in how these rules are defined. So that I guess is something that's useful to have. But I guess it's also not that one or two of these, a few of these companies are acting in bad faith. These capabilities are evolving really rapidly, and the companies that are building these things are the ones that have the best visibility into what those capabilities are and how to maybe respond to these things as well. So you need a collaboration between multiple stakeholders to come and deliberate on how these kind of responses should be framed. And I guess it's hard to also trust the labs completely because for them there's a lot at stake. There's a lot of investments that have gone in, and they need to find ways in which those investments can be recuperated and you can monetize the technology that they've built. So there's a lot of pressure for them to do that as well. So you have a lot of competing concerns from these different stakeholders. So you need multiple stakeholders in the room when you decide on things like this. And so I guess that's kind of the question for us on how governance needs to be done at a global level, and how do you bring these different stakeholders to the table when you decide these things.
Thank you so much, Bharat. This has been a fascinating conversation and a very interesting experiment with getting Claude as one of the speakers here. And to the audience, if questions like this are something you're interested in, the Takshashila Institution is providing a Politics and Policy of AI course, which would last 5 weeks in August. And you can head on over to the ECC page and apply there. Thank you so much.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.